70s classroom concentration had been punctured again. Each teenager struggled to focus on the revision topic of evolution. They had little chance, not with Jacob Stevens present. His intimidating voice made each classmate cower as he chewed on an apple noisily. Oh, look at Scott now, leaning over Abby's desk, helping her with her homework. Oh, I'll have to lean in a little closer, Abby, so I can hear you. A few students laughed nervously, but avoided looking into his ratty eyes. Oh dear, you don't understand this bit in evolution. Let me move this pencil for you. Don't be shy. Here, I'll hold your hand. Oh, now I'm standing up. Let me just check I've not got a boner. Nope. I'm all good, yeah? Nervously smooth my tie. There we go, big Scott. Class fell silent. That's quite enough, Jacob. Return to your seat. Mr. Scott smoothed his tie again. His face was bright red, and he spoke through grinding teeth. You will refer to me as Mr. Scott. Jacob ignored this and sat down with his feet on his desk. Mr. Scott returned to the front of the class. He'd lost him. Again. Abby was bright red and staring at the floor. Anything he said now about evolution, or the course, or about respect for teachers, may as well have been shouted into the mouth of an empty cave. Mr. Scott had run through the demise of this class hundreds of times to pinpoint the exact moment where Jacob Stevens had turned it into his own circus. He figured it to be the day he joined the school, when Jacob had sauntered in late and offered no note, no introduction, and no apology. When declaring this had been rather rude, Jacob had snapped back that there is nothing, absolutely nothing that you can do about it. Not once in 20 years of teaching had a student spoke to him in this manner. The first crack, it had shaken him. Letters and calls to his parents had done nothing. They said they paid the hefty fees and it was not their problem. After a month of abuse, Mr. Scott, embarrassed, approached his colleagues. They gave him a look of surprise when he described Jacob's behaviour. They said he sat at the back quietly, no issues. Mr. Scott, however, had become Jacob's sideshow, where his students observed him sweat, shout, and sometimes cry in front of the blackboard, as their chances of passing exams faded and his job security with it. He looked up and saw Jacob had somehow got hold of one of his spare ties. He was waving it around and kissing it like it was an Olympic medal. Mr. Scott snapped. Okay, Jacob, you win. What do you want me to do this time? What do you want me to do about this? Jacob stood in mock surprise, his mouth agape. What on earth do you mean, Scott? I'm dressed smart and fashionable. If I was your father, Jacob, I would box your ears! Mr. Scott gasped at his own words half a second before the rest of the class did. He had meant it. You'd like to hit me, would you now? Mr. Scott shuffled some papers. I'm sorry, class, I didn't mean to say that. Jacob raised his hand and gave a smile. It's all right, everyone. Scott, I'm 18 in 6 weeks. That night, Mr. Scott lay on the kitchen floor. He felt he belonged there. He replayed the day again in his head and its lowest point, when he had agreed to fight a school bully on his 18th birthday in exchange for good behaviour for the rest of term. He barely slept, and the next day he half expected to see the police, but when he returned to the classroom, he was shocked to find Jacob sat silently in a new seat at the back. He didn't say a word, and the rest of the class managed to get a lot done. The following week, the head teacher patted Mr. Scott's back and congratulated him on finally getting his classroom management in order. His class's midterm results were a massive improvement. They no longer needed to have an awkward conversation at the end of the year. Mr. Scott was even able to spend lunchtimes with his colleagues, instead of sitting with Jacob in detention. 5 weeks passed, and Mr. Scott was teaching on full form. The class was much happier too, and even started laughing at his corny jokes again. But as they filed out, Jacob pulled them to one side. "Next Friday, bring your keys to this classroom, 9:30, no earlier. We'll do it here." The sight of a birthday badge on Friday morning signalled to Mr. Scott that the fun of teaching was now over. He didn't even bother getting changed for the fight. He felt half the size of Jacob. The caretakers left. The class gathered by his door. Jacob was in sportswear and his knuckles looked red and hard. Mrs. Scott addressed his students awkwardly. "You all have to wait out here. I trust one of you has a first aid kit," he said. There were grumbles from the students who had already got their phones out ready to film. But Jacob raised his hand to silence them. "After you, Mr. Scott," he said, before locking the door behind him. Mr. Scott's classroom felt suddenly foreign. All its windows were completely papered over in old newspaper, making it dim and stuffy. The two men faced each other, surrounded by a sea of empty desks and chairs. There were grinding and scraping sounds as Jacob pulled a few to the side to make a small fighting area. Mr. Scott watched him silently. He prepared a speech about how this duel wasn't necessary and how Jacob's grades had actually improved. But from the way Jacob had now begun jabbing the air, he knew it was pointless. "All right then, sir, let's see what you've got." Before he could lunge, Mr. Scott raised his hand with a quiet sense of authority that made Jacob suddenly halt. He put on a pair of gloves, reached into his back pocket and removed a brown envelope. Inside was a small knife in a sheath. "Confiscated from you a month or so after you joined our school, Jacob." Jacob looked confused and took a step back, glancing at the door. "No weapons, Scott, fair fight." Mr. Scott said nothing and carefully removed the knife from its home with his gloved hands. "Don't worry, Jacob. I'm not going to hurt you. I'm thanking you for your good behaviour over the last month. You've let me do my job." He took a deep breath and plunged it deeply into his own gut. He gave a rehearsed yell of surprise and threw himself backwards against the decks, making a loud crash. Blood seeped rapidly from the wound, spattering on the floor. "No knives!" he shouted and knocked another table over. He lost consciousness to the sound of his class breaking down the door and piling on top of Jacob. Mr. Scott woke to blue lights and sirens as he was stretchered outside. He noticed the police holding down an angry and spitting Jacob against the bonnet of their vehicle. Mr. Scott laughed and then winced in agony. He heard familiar voices shouting his name. Suddenly his stretcher stopped and three colleagues appeared, their faces forming an amusing trio in the insipid light of the car park. Mr. Rowe, the geography teacher, had a black eye. Mrs. Hillary, the music teacher, had what looked like a broken nose. Then, more clearly, he saw the head teacher uttering heartfelt words of thanks through his mouth that was missing almost all of its front teeth. Thank you.